Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, I welcome all of you to our second episode on the series Truth and Reconciliation Commission and Aftermath. Today, we are very privileged to host Kimberly Murray, who was the Executive Director of Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and Ms. Aluk Fontaine Richardson. So we listen to them and their discussions. And before I begin, let me also do the treaty recognition. The Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, as we promised, our session today has been designed to listen more intently about the activities of Truth and Reconciliation Commission and also to understand what we are expecting in the future in moving forward. So today, the whole session will be moderated by Joint Master's Degree Program student from Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice, University of Manitoba, Mr. Chukudi Jim. So without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Chukudi Jim to take over the floor. Chukudi, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kasa. And I'm so grateful and delighted to welcome the both of you, Kimberly and Aluk, and all of our viewers joining us this evening as we brainstorm on the topic residential schools in Canada and the ways moving forward. Two negative legacies of residential schools in Canada are that the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the government and the churches is damaged, and the traumatic effects it has on the Indigenous peoples that needs to be healed. Reconciliation and healing are important frameworks of peace building. Many people, if not everyone, agree that there is urgent need for reconciliation between the Indigenous people of Canada and the Canadian government and the churches, as well as the need for holistic healing for the survivors and the families of residential schools. But there are varied opinions on how this should be done. The most notable effort towards healing and reconciliation was the CRRIC. In this webinar, we will be guided by two discussion questions. The first, what can we do to create healing and reconciliation? And the second one, what do healing and reconciliation mean for the Indigenous people? For our discussion this evening, I have the privilege to introduce our two guest speakers. First, I introduce Kimberly Murray. Kimberly Murray is a member of the Kanishitek Mohawk Nation. She is currently the executive lead for the newly created Survivors Secretariat at the Six Nations of the Grand River. Prior to his new role, Kimberly was the province of Ontario's first ever Assistant Deputy Attorney General for Indigenous Justice. Kimberly also was the Executive Director of the Truth and the Reconciliation Commission of Canada, where she worked to ensure that survivors of Canada's Indian residential schools were heard and remembered. And finally, from 1995 to 2010, Kimberly was a staff lawyer and then executive director of Aboriginal Legal Services of Toronto. And secondly, I have the privilege to introduce Luc Fontaine Richardson. She is a recent political science graduate from the University of Winnipeg, where she graduated with the gold medal for achievement in a major and the Rose Nolan Scholarship. While attending the university, she and a group of her classmates, along with their professor, Dr. Kausa Ahmed, co-founded Realize Radicalization, a student-led counter-extremism organization. Aluk currently serves as the coordinator of the organization. Aluk is an Ojibwe, a Cree, and a Mi'kmaq woman, and a proud member of Seguin First Nation. So I now welcome Kimberly for 20 minutes for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and hello to everybody. Sego Seguego, Kimberly Murray, and Getskanye Gahaga, Ganasitage Wakwaho. I introduced myself in Mohawk. I told you I'm Mohawk of Ganasitage, which is a First Nation in the province of Quebec, and I'm Wolf Clan. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I prepared. If I think Aluk was gonna put it up on the screen for me. I want to, it went away, there it is. I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, which is the Dish with One Spoon Treaty area. And I acknowledge First Nations, Indigenous people that reside here in this city. I thought that I would speak first about a bit about truth and reconciliation before I get into answering questions around health and what we need to move forward for healing. And if I could go to the first slide. During the life of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Elder Dave Cruchain said this about truth. He said, when you talk about truth, whose truth are you talking about? That quote really stuck with me when I heard him say that when we had a gathering of elders at the University of Manitoba. What I would encourage people to do when we think about truth and reconciliation is it's really important to think about whose truth you've listened to and whose truth is actually the appropriate truth. So I often will tell people, you know, in the history of Canada, we've had all kinds of stories written about Indigenous people, about residential schools. Some I would call propaganda. If you look at the CBC and some of those stories that they did about residential school, it was always this narrative that we were doing such good things for the Indigenous children. We were, you know, teaching them, educating them, and they were happy. And they would put these things up on the TV and on the radio, making it look like that great things were happening inside these institutions. So I would encourage everyone to really examine that truth and to listen to what the survivors have said. You know, it was mentioned in my bio that I'm a lawyer, and you know, I remember when I was in law school, one of the first days of law school in criminal law class, I had a professor who talked about the law, and he said that law is about proof and not about truth. And so when I went to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you know, it was one of the first times in my career where I actually didn't have to worry about proof, and it was all about truth and listening to the voices of survivors and their families about what happened to them. So if I could go to the next slide, please. When it comes to reconciliation, this is what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission defined reconciliation. They said that it's about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. In order for that to happen, there has to be awareness of the past, acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted, atonement for the causes, and action to change behavior. That's the definition that Justice Sinclair and the two commissioners provided in the final report. And I encourage everyone to think about all four aspects of that definition. And so often, we forget about the action to change behavior. I'm mindful of when the apology was issued by Stephen Harper in Parliament. There was so much hope for many survivors that the apology was being made, but there was no action attached to the apology. There was no, like in some countries, when there's an apology, they said, we're going to do X, Y, and Z within this many years. There is nothing to hold the government to when it came to reconciliation and moving forward with the apology. It's not enough for us to, recognize the past. It's not enough for us to just listen to the truth. There has to be that action plan. There has to be that commitment to move forward. And I think that, those are what we're going to talk about on this panel this evening. If I could go to the next slide, please. So often we say that reconciliation is not about forgiving and forgetting. Often we've heard that comment from people, why can't you just get over it? It was so long ago, let's move forward and let's only talk about the good things and not the bad, and why are you always focusing on the negative? And it goes again to that, it's really important we have the truth before we have the reconciliation. And, with the recoveries of the children on the grounds of the former residential schools, that's a continuation of the truth that has been shared by survivors for decades and coming to the attention of broader society now. And we can't just get over that. We can't just forgive and forget. If I can go to the next slide, please. And so what we say, it's about remembering and changing. We have to change our behaviors, and we have to change the way our institutions operate, and we have to change the way that we think about each other and talk to each other. So the commissioners always said it's about remembering and changing. Next slide, please. I like to share this quote from someone who attended one of the national events that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held, and I believe it was when we were in Halifax. And it was a non-Indigenous person, actually, who came up to the microphone at one of the events, and she said, by hearing your story, my story can change. And by hearing your story, I can change. And I think that really resonated with a lot of people. And, Justice Sinclair always said that reconciliation is about how we talk to one another and how we talk about one another. And so really learning about each other and listening to each other and hearing the truths, the real truths, is how we're going to achieve change and move towards reconciliation. Next slide, please. And I think this was also said in the introduction of the panel tonight. This is what the CRRC wrote in the final report, that the most significant damage is to the trust that has been broken between the Crown and Indigenous people. And that broken trust must be repaired. And if we can't rebuild trust, then we're never going to achieve reconciliation. Next slide, please. I know you all know this. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued 94 calls to action, and you can go to the next slide. And of those 94 calls to action, there was a number of themes: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, justice, and reconciliation. I encourage everyone that don't just read the calls to action. It's really important that you understand the context of those calls, and to do that, you need to read the actual report. Both the history volumes, the legacy volumes, and the reconciliation volumes, to really put meaning to the calls to action. Next slide, please. And so we always get these questions about what can you do and how to move forward. And often we talk about how it's really important for non-Indigenous people to examine their own assumptions about what they think and know about Indigenous people. And, you know, people also need to be open to feeling uncomfortable when we have conversations about reconciliation. It goes back to that. It goes back to what I said when people say, well, why can't we just get over it and let's be nice and think about the future? We have to be prepared to have those difficult conversations and feel uncomfortable. If we're not feeling uncomfortable, then we're never going to get to reconciliation. There has to be, you know, this movement towards respect for Indigenous people. And that comes with knowing each other and understanding what's happened and the things that we've had to endure. And also, you know, we need to really consider the way in which we might be relying and building on policies and processes that are hostile towards Indigenous people, and we have to correct them. So what I often see, and, you know, having worked in government for 6 years in the province, you know, there's a lot of tinkering. People want to tinker with things. They want to take the colonial systems and processes that have been put in place that have oppressed Indigenous people and tinker with them. But they don't actually want to change the paradigm. They don't actually want to change the actual systems. So I often say it's like when people say we need to think outside of the box, I say we need to get rid of the box. You know, thinking outside the box isn't enough. And so I'm encouraging people to think inside the circle, changing the paradigm of how we do things. So it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for settlers and for you know, colonial institutions to think about how they can do things in a new way. And I often say to people, especially in the justice sector where I work, is that you know, if we were to change the way the justice system worked, people would be out of jobs. If we were to revitalize Indigenous legal systems, Indigenous legal orders, that means we don't need the colonial court system and we don't need the colonial laws. And that scares people. And our leaders have said, you know, our people are an industry. And that's true when it comes to child welfare. That's true when it comes to the healthcare system. That's true when it comes to the justice system. We are an industry. And if we were to fix those systems, then the industry would disappear and people would have to find new jobs. And so, you know, it's uncomfortable conversation to say that. We actually don't need colonial judges or colonial laws. Indigenous people have their own ways of being. And the TRC report, especially the reconciliation volume and those calls to action, are about revitalization, revitalizing language, revitalizing those systems that were oppressed and taken away through the churches and through the government. And without that revitalization, we're never going to achieve reconciliation because we'll always be in that box. Whether we're thinking outside of it, we're still in that box and we need to get rid of the box. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the conversation tonight.
Okay, Kimberly, thank you very much for that insightful and very concise presentation. And I now invite Aluk to give her view.
Thank you so much, by the way, for the introduction, and thanks so much, Kimberly, for agreeing and your wonderful presentation. So, as you guys have heard, my name is Luc Fontaine Richardson. It's an honor to be here tonight on CRRIC's newest episode of their webinar series. Before I begin, I'm in Winnipeg, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently residing on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, CRRI, OG-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So, interestingly enough, I myself am residing on the traditional land of my ancestors. I'm Ojibwe, Cree, and Mi'kmaq, and a proud member of Saugeen First Nation, which is a Treaty 1 signatory. The topic of today's webinar is one very close to home for me, as I'm an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. My Mishum grandpa, for those who don't know Ojibwe, great grandma, great grandpa, and numerous other family members all attended these schools. So because this is such a personal topic for me, I was really honored to ask to be a guest tonight, especially among such esteemed company. And I will say my presentation, unfortunately, don't have a PowerPoint, and I'm taking, I guess, a more philosophical, personal lens to this, but I really just want to kind of shed light on reconciliation and healing, on residential schools and their devastating and ongoing legacy, and establish some principles, at least that I think are essential to enacting substantial reconciliation and healing within Canada. So I'm almost certain that everyone watching this webinar is aware, but in case I'm reaching the 1% who isn't aware, I will just give a slight background on residential schools. So residential schools were formally established in the 1880s by the Canadian government, and they were run by the church. I also think it's important to say that, and Kimberly mentioned this as well, that they were not about education. I know that's become kind of a news story because, Erin O'Toole and kind of comments that were made about the original intention of the schools. But I do want to say that those were not the original intention of the school. I think the person who said it best, the original intention of the school, is the then Deputy Superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott. And he said, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole object of the bill. So when he was discussing this, and he said this very strong statement, he was talking about passing a bill that made attendance at residential schools compulsory. And I think this quote obviously reveals the true intention of these schools, which was not about education at all. It was about forcefully assimilating Indigenous children into dominant Canadian culture and extinguishing Indigenous identity once and for all. So over the course of more than 100 years, approximately 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their families and forced to attend these schools. They were forbidden from speaking their language, practicing their culture, and they endured horrific physical, psychological, and sexual abuse. And I'm sure you guys have heard the news stories about the children that were found. So an estimated 4,100 children are reported to have died while attending these schools, according to the DRC, although with survivors' testimony and stuff, people say that the actual number may be substantially larger than that. So I could obviously spend this whole webinar talking about residential schools because, there's so much more that can be said, but I'm going to leave it there. And I'm going to talk a bit more about the path forwards towards healing and reconciliation for Indigenous people. So these two concepts are very heavily intertwined, and you can't have one without the other, essentially. So any attempt at healing a wrong committed by another requires reconciliation, and any true effort at reconciliation requires the healing of a damaged relationship. I also do want to say that when I'm speaking today, I'm only sharing my individual perspective as an Indigenous person, and I can't speak for all Indigenous people because everyone has their own conceptualization of what healing and what reconciliation is. So now with that disclaimer, so I also think that it's important to state that healing and reconciliation are not linear at all, and they're not processes that have a firm start and end date. So these schools were around for over 100 years, and they're one of many genocidal policies enacted by the Canadian government, dating back to the start of colonization. So if our situation is to be healed or even improved at all, it won't happen overnight. And it won't even happen probably within the next couple of generations. It'll take a long time, at least as long as there's been colonial oppression and subjugation. Fortunately, as a result, spoiler alert, there's no quick fix to any of this. So for me, my understanding of healing and reconciliation is very rooted in a holistic lens. That means I don't believe that we should measure progress from a purely statistical outlook. And that's not me saying that we don't need to correct the enormous disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, including the overrepresentation in the foster care system, the lower educational outcomes, and the poor health generally experienced by Indigenous people. And a lot of these are the direct result of residential schools. And I do think we should confront them, but it's also important to look at other less measurable factors. So I think that it's absolutely integral that any efforts to address the impact of residential schools and move forward have to be done with compassion and an understanding that many of the wounds inflicted upon survivors and their families are unseen to a lot of people, to the outside world. So I think this is really important to keep that in mind when you discuss healing and reconciliation, because the impacts of these schools aren't going to always present in the same way to other people. It might look different from a person to person basis. So, speaking from my own personal perspective, I directly obviously did not go to residential schools, but I can say the residential schools have had an incredibly negative impact on my own life. And that's not something that can be fully captured by reading anything in the media, reading a government publication, or fully grasped by people who haven't been brushed by the long arm of residential schools. Because of residential schools and their policies, I don't speak or understand any of my traditional languages, even though a lot of my family members are fluent. And I experience a lot of disconnect and even sometimes shame surrounding my own heritage, which was a lesson taught in many residential schools to my family members. So, and my family dynamics, along with many other Indigenous people, are still heavily informed by the generations before me that attended residential schools. So sadly, my story is not unique at all among Indigenous peoples. There's a lot of these things experienced by other people. So basically, if reconciliation and healing is to take place, non-Indigenous people have to understand just how deep some of these wounds are among Indigenous people and recognize that residential schools left a painful legacy that's still ongoing for people whose family members or who directly attended these schools. So they're severe and ongoing impacts. So without an attempt to understand and be compassionate towards Indigenous survivors and intergenerational survivors, some with stories like mine, some with stories wildly different than mine, there's no basis for healing and reconciliation. So, from my own personal perspective, and I think some people would agree with me, healing from residential schools and attempts to, build reconciliation is something that's a gradual process. And I can't definitively say what it will look like because, as I mentioned earlier, it's different from person to person. But I do hope that what this means is that any Indigenous person has equal access to opportunities and is treated with the same dignity or respect as any other person and enjoys equal mental and physical health outcomes as any non-Indigenous person in Canada. That's what I hope healing and reconciliation will look like at some point in the future, but I can't give a definitive date, obviously. One thing I am sure of, I hope everyone understands, is that healing and reconciliation will require a lot of work and a lot of patience and a genuine commitment from all treaty people, i.e., all Canadians. So, because residential schools were intended to deprive Indigenous people from their own culture, aka in the oft repeated quote, to kill the Indian and the child, healing from the legacy of residential schools will hopefully have the opposite effect of residential schools, whereby every Indigenous person is given the opportunity to fully embrace their culture and language, and they feel very supported in their journey to feel pride rather than shame of their heritage. And I think every single one of us has to commit to helping achieve this for future generations, if not our own. Um, but, and I think Kimberly mentioned this, you mentioned the apology, and that was obviously a big symbolic step for people. But like you said, it can't be just an apology, it requires action. So an apology without real change, it cheats every Canadian out of the healing and reconciliation we all expect and deserve. So healing and reconciliation have been a lot on like the media's landscape lately. It's been talked about, because we recently had a holiday on September 30th. And, it seems to be on a lot of people's minds. A lot of people are talking about it, but it's important to know that it's not a buzzword or a passing trend. These kind of things, healing and reconciliation, are sustained efforts that require a paradigm shift in the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. So the current relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people is asymmetrical because it's not built on an equal playing field at all. So without a kind of equal playing field between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, they're not equal partners at all. And if you can't have an equal partnership, you can't equally serve both parties in the way that they deserve. So, Indigenous people today, I could draw up a bunch of statistics, are still facing severe inequality in their own country, and they're navigating the ongoing and negative impacts of a system intended to wipe them out. And they're also living lives deprived of the promises of the treaties their forebears signed. So, to even hope for reconciliation and healing from residential schools first means repairing the relationship between Indigenous and non Indigenous people and elevating it to an equal nation to nation relationship. I think this will pave the way towards constructive dialogue, meaningful action, and the actualization of the treaties that helped found this very nation. So, once this occurs, I'm hopeful that Indigenous people will find themselves in a position where they can begin to feel more valued, especially politically and socially, and feel like they're more equal partners because we're currently not. So, hopefully, this equal partnership will allow people to enact their own policies that will give survivors and their families a path towards recovering and healing from residential schools. So, basically, to summarize that very long-winded sentence, there has to be minimum standards and basic principles of respect established for Indigenous people before any true Indigenous informed reconciliation or healing can even begin to unfold. So, along with the many incredible steps recommended by the likes of the TRC, which I strongly urge any viewer to read, Indigenous leaders and advocates and everyday Indigenous people, I believe the path forward towards equal partnership, equality, and repairing the damage caused by residential schools requires every single Canadian to do something very simple. And that something very simple is to listen. So people have to truly commit to listening to the stories of survivors and their families, trying to understand the trauma experienced by Indigenous people at residential schools and other traumatic experiences, and giving each person the space and the opportunity to have a voice in this country, because for many years, Indigenous people have been deprived of their voice and the chance to share their perspective. And I think now, as we approach this kind of new age, I hope in the relationship between Indigenous people and the government and non-Indigenous people, I think now's the time to change this kind of voiceless thing that has been happening for far too long. So I think listening is how genuine healing from residential schools and reconciliation will begin to flourish, and hopefully the nation as a whole will benefit from that. So, Miigwech, for your time and the opportunity to talk about this important topic today.
Okay, yeah, thank you, the both of you, for those wonderful insights. And at least today, you guys have made us to understand when we talk about truth, which truth are we talking about? That is a very important question. And we should also try to examine and we should listen to the voices of the survivors and their families. And you have made us to understand that reconciliation is all about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. And um, and it is true, from what you guys said, that the truth should be known before the reconciliation. We should not hide from the truth. That's a very wonderful point to note. And reconciliation is also all about remembering and also changing. If we remember, we also work towards changing our behavior towards indigenous people. And there is need to rebuild the trust. I strongly believe that there is need to work towards rebuilding the trust. And what what can we do moving forward? Among other things, you guys suggested that there should be need for revitalizing the indigenous institutions and cultures, and there is need for genuine listening, and that is very, very important. There is need to listen, because when you listen to people's stories, you will now understand their stories. And one of the remarkable points you guys made today, Aluk, that residential schools was originally founded to get rid of the Indian problem and question. Yeah, because many people are having this notion that it was founded to educate the indigenous people, to civilize them. But today, you may not understand that the major reason is to get rid of the Indian problem and the Indian question. Then the path moving forward, we have to acknowledge the pains of these survivors. We should acknowledge them, and you may not understand that healing and reconciliation, they are gradual processes. It takes time, so we have to be patient, and there is need to be compassionate, and more especially equal opportunities and the dignity should be accorded to everyone. That up to today, even the Aboriginal people are still treated like second citizens. And if we really want to heal and reconcile, there is need for action. Not only hollow apology is not enough. So those are wonderful insights for food for thought. But I would like to ask some questions. So, Kimberly, first to you. You were part of the CRRIC. How did that commission come about? What were the original intentions for constituting the commission? And do you think today the commission has achieved its original intentions? And why are we still today talking about healing and reconciliation after how many years?
Yeah, so thanks for those questions. One of the things I think is really important for people to understand is that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out of a lawsuit. So we had very brave survivors across Canada start filing lawsuits against Canada and the churches, and created a national consortium of survivors, and it resulted in a settlement agreement. It is the largest settlement agreement in Canadian history, and there were 5 components to the settlement agreement, and the TRC was only one of the 5 components. So it's really important to recognize that there was some reparation in relation of compensation that was available under the settlement agreement. But when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was doing its work, through the leadership of the Assembly of First Nations and the National Chief and the various parties to the settlement agreement, we were told about how during the negotiations of that settlement agreement, when it came to the TRC, most of the people had left the table. All the lawyers, they figured out their compensation that they were going to get under the compensation scheme. And it was actually the survivors themselves and the Assembly of First Nations that pushed for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It wasn't something the churches wanted. It wasn't something that Canada wanted, the government. It was the survivors. And that's because the compensation mechanism of the settlement agreement was all done behind closed doors. It was all done in private hearings, and those decisions on compensation are not public. And in fact, there was a whole case that went to the Supreme Court of Canada that those decisions are going to be destroyed and not kept for the history. And so it was really important to the survivors that Canadians and the world hear their voices and share what happened to them in the residential schools. And so the mandate of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was given to the commissioners under the settlement agreement. And it has a lot in the mandate about things that they weren't allowed to do. And so I know lots of academics have written about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and criticized some of the things because they had no powers. The commissioners had no powers to compel perpetrators to attend the events. Everything was voluntary. We had no powers to get the records. We actually had to go to court to enforce the settlement agreement to get Canada and the churches to provide records to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Moving forward, I know that a lot of work went into deciding what the TRC would look like and what its mandate would be, and a lot of examination of other truth commissions around the world were taken into consideration. But it would have been great if the commissioners had a little bit more powers than what they had under the settlement agreement, because it ended up taking a lot of our efforts to get the churches and the government to provide records and to comply with their agreements. You asked, I think the second part of the question was in relation to whether the mandate was complied with. So we had to gather statements from survivors, and there were oh gosh, you're my memory now. I can't remember how many statements we gathered. I think it was 7,000. I could be wrong there. From survivors. We had to gather documents. We gathered 5 million records, and those are currently stored at the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. We had to hold 7 national events, which we did, and we had to prepare a final report with recommendations. And so that's the report. So the commissioners did fulfill their mandate. We ran out of time on the document collection because of the litigation, and that's ongoing, and you're seeing that play out now with everything that's happening on the recovery of children, and a number of churches did not provide their records to the TRC. And I also would say this, the Truth Commission didn't have any powers in relation to provinces and other institutions. It's not just the federal government or the church entities that have records in relation to Indian residential schools. Provinces have records. Provinces have death records. Institutions like universities have records. I'm working with the survivors from the Mohawk Institute here in Ontario, which is down in Six Nations, and it is the first residential school in Canada. It opened in 1828 and it closed in 1970. There are many, many, many institutions that went in that building and had involvement with those children and with that institute. And so we know that there are records out there that we need to obtain, and we will be doing that in the work of the Survivor Secretariat. I think one of the things, just to go to your third point that you asked me to speak to, the commissioners and the Survivor Advisory Circle often talked about how important it was to move people from their head to their heart. And the TRC writes about that a lot. For us to get to reconciliation, we need people to actually feel the pain that First Nations people, Indigenous people have been subjected to by colonization, by oppression, by the horrible harms that were done to them in these institutions and other institutions, I might add. When I reflect now that on the conversation, I actually think, and I did a panel just the other day with Chief Bobby Joseph, who's one of the survivors that worked with the Secretariat and runs Reconciliation Canada, about, I think it's a good thing that people are still talking about reconciliation. As Aluk said, it's not going to happen overnight. And so if we weren't talking about it, I'd be very concerned if we're not talking about it. The fact that people are still talking means that they're thinking about it. And there has been change. I have seen it in the last 6-7 years. I saw it happening when I was working at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I would say where we see it the most, it's with personal and individual experiences between people. We see it more at the municipal level than at the federal level. So it's like those smaller entities, those people having that connection with their neighbor. And, I remember survivors saying, reconciliation to me would be if my neighbor could say good morning to me in my language, or reconciliation would be a good start if people knew what treaty territory that their house is located on and learned the history of the First Nation that their neighbor is. And I think that we see that happening a lot more than we see on the broader scale with the federal government and with, the national church entities. And, it's really about making that commitment on a personal level, and then take that into your professional life, and looking at what can you do in the institutional level or the professional level of the sector you may be working in. So I'll stop there.
Okay, that was good. That was good to remind us that for the fact that we are still talking about reconciliation today, it's a sign. It's a positive sign that people are still thinking about it. People are still feeling about it. But more especially for there to be healing and reconciliation, that should be that empathy we should feel for these survivors and their families. And to you, Aluk, and you are a youth from the Seguin community, and I know the community very well. So what are you hearing from the youth? What is their impression about healing and reconciliation? Because they are the future. They are the future of every society. So what are you beginning to hear from the perspective of the youth? What they think about healing and reconciliation around these residential schools issues?
Well, I obviously don't know every single youth, but like from the people I know, I'm kind of getting like, I guess, I should say mixed reviews kind of to reconciliation, because obviously with what happened with September 30th, and also just it was a huge, I guess, more of an election point. So more of the general public was talking about reconciliation. And I think that led to a lot more attention around Indigenous people. Like, for example, when I went on September 30th, we went to a powwow in Winnipeg, and there was a lot of people there, like Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So I think definitely there's a lot of like good intentions for sure. And I was like speaking to a friend, and he was like, it's crazy. Like, people were asking, like, what was your opinion? Obviously, he's Indigenous, and asking him what was his opinion on residential schools, and like, had he had anyone attend? Obviously, they were being very well meaning. So I think he felt good, because a lot of times it's very easy to feel not very seen by other people if you're Indigenous. Like, people don't really care about your issues. It's not like a sexy topic or whatever. But I think it's nice. And then I had that positive story. But then on the other hand, I get at least from people in my family, there's a lot of anger, because people are wondering, why are we talking about this now? Like, it's been happening for this long. Why is it suddenly a discussion point? Why wasn't it talked about before? And also that it's really unfair, because there has been a lot of gestures, and a lot of people think they're just symbolic gestures, and they're not actually going to result in any substantial change for Indigenous peoples and their situation. So I think there is kind of a mixed perspective, and I know there's a lot of disenfranchisement among Indigenous youth, at least from what I've seen, who feel like the Canadian government and Canadian society has failed them, honestly. So I got a really kind of mixed answer there. So I couldn't give like a clear-cut answer, but yeah, I think generally, if I'm going to be optimistic, I think there's a lot of hope that this is just the first, stepping point towards much more talk about reconciliation, and hopefully much more action. So,
Yeah, because why I ask you such a question, in peace building, the youths, they are very, very important. You must really take them into considerations, because they are the engine of the society. They are the future. So we need to listen to them and to hear them, their own inputs on the way forward, because they are the one to continue the struggle. So we need to listen to the youths. And my final question for both of you, any of you can answer. If you are to advise, because I believe reconciliation is a two-way something. If I'm reconciling with you, you have to play a part. I will play a part, because whereby I'm the one making efforts and you are not responding, it might not work. It's a two-way or three-way something. So if any of you is to advise the Canadian government, the churches, or the indigenous people, and I mean the things any of them can do, because I believe that the indigenous people, they also have a role towards the reconciliation. So if any of you can, if you're asked to advise any of these people, the Canadian government, the churches, the indigenous people, on what they can do to foster a broader healing and reconciliation, what would be your advice to any of them?
I mean, I guess what I think it just goes back to this idea that we have to work together for there to be reconciliation. And when I think about governments and bureaucrats, which I used to be one, it's always about the quick wins, so the low-hanging fruit. What can we do during this election cycle to get some votes? And that's not how reconciliation works. And I know people have heard that saying, nothing about us without us, that sort of mantra. That's a really important concept, and that's a really important approach that has to happen. And I also think, it can't just be sort of on the surface, right? It has to, I'll give you an example. I used this the other day when I was in a talk. I had someone call me once when I was working at the Attorney General's office, saying they had an idea for reconciliation. They wanted to put a mural, an Indigenous mural, inside the courthouse in the jail cell area. And they thought that was, going to further reconciliation. And, this was just a non-Indigenous person meaning well. I think they did mean well, but, I can see Aluk kind of smiling, that's not reconciliation. We don't want to make our people feel comfortable in jail cells. We actually want to keep them out of jail. So we need to go a little bit deeper in the things that we're doing, and we need to speak to one another and explain what's needed and why something like that is not what's needed. And so, we're seeing a lot across Canada of this institutions hiring Indigenous people, but they're doing their hiring with the one person, and that one person is supposed to know the answer to everything, and that's just can't happen. You need to do cluster hiring. You need to have whole departments in your organization that are working on this. You need to have advisories, and you need to pay Indigenous people to help fix those institutions that need fixing. And so but I'm going to end where I started. And I really do think, and I've reflected on this for a number of years now. I really do think that, we're never going to get to reconciliation if we don't revitalize and support Indigenous communities to revitalize their languages, their laws, and their own systems in every area. And until we do that in a meaningful way and truly do that, we won't achieve reconciliation.
I don't think I could top that answer, even close, but I'll share a little bit of my perspective. So, ultimately, I think moving forward, what could actually result in something positive happening and maybe a situation improving for Indigenous people would be, I would say, primarily an attitude shift. And that's among every single party because the government is composed of people, obviously, too. And I know, they have certain attitudes and it might be rooted in, colonial attitudes because, their their whole purpose is kind of to serve as a colonial instrument in some ways, arguably not all the time. But I think there needs to be a definitive attitude shift. Um, Especially, like, I was reading just when I was kind of prepping for this, that a recent poll, and this is from, like, the last year, says that 68% of Canadians think that Indigenous people are entitled and act entitled, and I'm just like, "Wow, that blows my mind," because that's a majority of people having that attitude, and I think if so many people have that attitude, they first of all, reconciliation is not gonna meaningfully happen if a large group of non-Indigenous people think that Indigenous people are entitled. That is not a good way to start a healthy relationship at all. So I think first step, attitude change. People need to do their research and they need to engage in webinars like this and read the TRC final report and do kind of like, you have to be self motivated and you have to learn about Indigenous people and our history. And I think only then can you kind of fully understand and kind of be a partner that's willing to actually help Indigenous people and not, kind of be adopt a paternalistic attitude, which has been the attitude of the past and obviously has not led us to anything positive. So that was a very, very long-winded answer, but basically, yeah, attitude shift from governments, um, from non-Indigenous people, and also from Indigenous people ourselves. I know a lot of people are angry. It's completely understandable. Sometimes I get angry because, it seems like a really terrible lot to get sometimes being an Indigenous person in Canada because you're automatically come at a disadvantage. So, it's easy to be very angry and it's completely understandable. But I also think if I can tell to anyone, maybe at least my age, channel your anger into something positive, channel it into making positive change because that is what is going to change things is having a good attitude and be willing to work alongside non-Indigenous people and be an equal partner. So
Yeah, thank you for that last point. The indigenous youth should they should come out and channel their energies. As you said, it's understandable to be angry. I mean, but they should not accept it as the last option. They should move beyond being angry and channel their energies. And one final point I want to make, and I believe that the indigenous process of reconciliation is very good. So for my personal suggestion towards the discussion, I would suggest that maybe while we talk about reconciliation and healing, we should explore. We should explore some of these indigenous process of healing and reconciliation because it will make sense to the indigenous people. It will make sense to them. They will understand what they are talking. So I believe that the government and the churches should also explore maybe using some of these indigenous healing processes and the reconciliation methods, and maybe that will make sense to the indigenous people. So we have I so much thank the two of you for your wonderful and insightful presentations and discussions today. And moving forward in my webinar with CRRIC, and the next webinar will look at the voices of the churches. I wanna listen to there is need to listen to all voices. So in my next webinar, I hope to invite some church leaders to also listen to them on the way moving forward. and what the church has done towards healing and reconciliation. So I invite every one of our viewers to look up for the next webinar, which will be on hearing from the churches and the church leaders for us to balance the story. Yeah. So I thank all of you, and I'm so grateful that you were able to come, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice.
You're welcome.
Is it still live? Okay. Bye, everyone.